Welcome to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Rosensweet, mom of 3 young people, peaceful parenting coach, and your cheerleader and guide on all things parenting. Each week, we'll cover the tools, strategies, and support you need to end the yelling and power struggles and encourage your kids to listen and cooperate so that you can enjoy your family time. I'm happy to say we have a great relationship with our 3 kids. The teen years have been easy and joyful, not because we're special unicorns, but because my kids were raised with peaceful parenting. I've also helped so many parents just like you stop struggling and enjoy their kids again. I'm excited to be here with you today and bring you the insight and information you need to make your parenting journey a little more peaceful. Let's dive into this week's conversation. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. Today's episode is a guest expert interview with Sarah R. Moore. Sarah is the author of Peaceful Discipline, Story Teaching, Brain Science, and Better Behavior, and the founder of Dandelion Seeds Positive Parenting. As a master trainer in conscious parenting and a board member for the American Society for the Positive Care of Children, she's also a public speaker, armchair, neuroscientist, and most importantly, a mama. This was a really fun conversation talking to another person who supports parents like I do and we do. And Sarah has a lot of great ideas for you in terms of how to do this peaceful discipline thing. Speaking of peaceful discipline, the first place we always start when we want to do peaceful parenting and we want to be parents who stay calm and confident and have a great relationship with our kids, the first thing we want to look at is how is our self-regulation? Can we stay calm when our kids are acting out, being provocative, not cooperating, not listening is really, really hard. And especially if you were raised with a lot of yelling or, if you're stressed or being low on resources or having a hard time. However, there's a lot that you can do to improve your ability to self-regulate. And I just want to point out that self-regulation doesn't mean you never get upset. It means that you recognize when you are getting upset and you know how to calm yourself and you try to calm yourself so that you can respond to your child in these difficult moments rather than reacting out of your own anger and frustration. So it's always where we start with peaceful parenting. If you would like some more support around this, I have a free e-course called How to Stop Yelling at Your Kids, and it is available to you at sarahrosensweet.com/yelling. So again, check out my free course. It's all about how to stay calm when your kids are having a hard time. They're having a hard time, not giving us a hard time, even if it feels like it sometimes. You can just go to sarahrosensweet.com/yelling. Okay, let's meet Sarah. Hi, Sarah. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, other Sarah. I appreciate you.
I know. I love talking to another Sarah, and we both spell it the right way with an H.
We do. Yay, Team H.
Yeah. So I wanted to have you on the podcast because we've sort of been colleagues and Facebook friends, and we've never really gotten to talk in real life. So this is a fun excuse to do that. And also because you have a new book out, and that's super exciting. And I wanted to support you in that. So maybe we could start out by you could just tell us a little bit about your new book.
Well, thank you so very much. I really appreciate it. My new book is called Peaceful Discipline, Story Teaching, Brain Science, and Better Behavior. And the gist of it is, it may even catch people off guard a little bit. We tend to think of discipline as sort of a loaded word. Even those of us who have practiced gentle parenting for a long time still kind of get our shackles up when we hear the word discipline. How is this person going to approach it? Is it going to be punitive? How is it going to feel for the child? So by coupling it with the word peaceful, it's a reminder not only to us as the parent or caregiver that discipline is supposed to be a peaceful process, not only in what we do, but also in how the child perceives it. So I go into specifically a whole lot of different very actionable tools and strategies that we can use proactively to help prevent problems from coming up in the moment. So let's say things are suddenly going off the rails with our child and we need some peaceful way to react right then and there. And also reactively, something has happened that didn't go the way we wanted. How do we follow up with our child to help increase the likelihood that it won't happen again? So all of this is within the framework of my training, which is really pretty diverse. It is brain science and neuroscience, interpersonal neurobiology. It's also improv comedy and all of the best practices that I have learned in conscious parenting, attachment theory, all the other good stuff woven into this book about basically how to bring more joy back to parenting and more connection back with our kids.
I love that you've got improv comedy thrown in there. And I was actually just talking to someone about that the other day, about how improv actually should be part of our training, because that whole, at least as I understand improv, is you never say no to anything. Not that we don't say no to our children, but that you're always sort of looking for a way to continue the story and the fun, right?
That's exactly it. Yes, it's the concept of yes and. If I walk onto stage and I say that I'm a kitty cat, somebody is, my partner on stage isn't going to say, "You're not a cat, you're a unicorn." Suddenly that catches me off guard. I was planning to be a cat. Instead, someone looks at me and they're like, "Oh, would you like a bowl of milk?" or whatever. They just go with it. And this is such a useful tool in parenting to, we can talk about examples, but oftentimes so much conflict comes from when we're trying to stop a behavior rather than using the behavior as the segue into something else.
That's right. I love that so much. And I also love that I love the title, Peaceful Discipline. I actually have a workshop called Peaceful Discipline. And I think it's really important to remember that discipline actually means teaching, right? And that today we think of it so much as punishment, but that's not actually what it means.
Exactly. Yes, and I want the world to know this. So I love that you and I have things with the same name. That's great.
All right. Well, you know what? I thought one thing that would be really interesting to talk to you about today is something that comes up a lot in my community. And I think probably most of our colleagues is that people who maybe are new to peaceful parenting, or maybe are a little doubtful, their kids are younger, or maybe they haven't been doing it for that long, and they always wonder, I get this question so much. Yeah, but what about in the real world? Like, what about, what don't kids have to learn that that there are consequences if they're late for work, then they might lose their job, or that, people aren't going to play with them to get them to do things outside of the family. So let's talk about that. Does that come up in your community, that doubt?
All the time. I'm saying that in capital letters. That is such a common fear. And that's basically what it boils down to. It's a fear. We have a desire to be gentle and peaceful with our children, but we have this fear that we are somehow setting them up to fail if we aren't harsher with them. Because we look around and say, well, the world is a pretty darn harsh place. So am I coddling them? And the truth is, by being peaceful with them, a couple of things happen. Number one, we become their safe place where they can learn, where they have the emotional safety to say, when something comes up that is a problem, I am going to run to my parent for support and guidance and teaching, i.e., discipline, as opposed to running away and hiding from my parent and perhaps even worsening my behavior and setting myself up for even harsher outcomes. Another thing happens too when we raise our children with peaceful discipline, they grow to expect kindness in the relationships that they choose around them. Could be in romantic relationships, could be in friendships, could be in the workplace, could be whatever. And if somebody is unkind to them, they say, I'm not going to stand for that. That feels foreign to me, and I'm out. And instead, what you get there is not somebody who can't function, but instead someone who chooses healthy relationships. And the more contagious, in a very good way, this becomes, the kinder and gentler the world becomes. This really is a life changing movement that you and I do together. And yes, there will be times when the world won't be as nice to them. But that being said, that's not the kind of teaching environment where the child can actually grow and thrive. Quick little neuroscience tidbit. We all have a limbic system in our brain, and its primary job is to keep us alive. Its job is to look around us at every moment of every day, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, and ask the question, am I safe here? And if it detects a threat of any sort, whether that threat is an oncoming car or whether it's somebody yelling at them, the brain does not say, fantastic, I really want to learn about this situation. Instead, what the brain does is basically shuts off the learning area and says, I need to get out of here because my only goal is self preservation. So, teaching through fear, teaching through punishment, directly contradicts how the brain actually works. And if we want our children to absorb the messages that we are teaching them, they have to feel safe for that to happen.
Yeah, they have to have an open mind and heart to learning, and that if they're shut down, they're not going to be able to do that.
Exactly, yeah. And I share an example in my book about a time when I was pulled over for speeding. And I confess it was my mistake. I was speeding. I should not have been speeding. And the police officer, in my opinion, was extremely harsh with me and it felt terrible. But the thing is, I actually didn't realize I was speeding. I was on a big old country road with nobody around anywhere for miles and miles. I was simply like cranking the tunes and enjoying the scenery and whatever. And I lost track of my velocity. So when she pulled me over, and to her credit, she did the right thing. I could have hurt myself or somebody else or an animal or whatever. She did the right thing by pulling me over. But I was in such a state of panic that the rest of the drive, I didn't feel like, oh my goodness, I never want to speed again. Even though, of course, I don't want to speed again because I know that I'm not supposed to do that. But it actually left me feeling so unsafe that I was probably a worse driver for the rest of the drive because I was so shaken up from the exchange. So this is certainly not a knock on the police force, no commentary about that whatsoever. But that being said, even in those situations where there are quote unquote traditional consequences, we still have to remember that all of us have a deep innate desire, whether we are 22 or 92, to be met with somebody who inquires, hey, I'm curious what's going on for you. Are you aware that you were speeding? I want to make sure you're safe, or whatever that translation would be for an activity the child is engaged in.
Yeah, I mean, to your example, that person of authority could have gotten the same message across to you, and including the punishment of the speeding ticket or whatever if they think that's necessary, and have done it in a kind way, and it maybe sounds like it would have been even more effective for you.
Absolutely. Yeah, my nervous system would not have been on high alert for the rest of the drive. I wouldn't have been so hyper focused on what just happened that I was suddenly unable to think as clearly as I might have if it had felt like a more peaceful exchange. And
And you're a grown up, and so you were able to sort of parse that out for yourself and realize what was going on. What I find happens with kids is they can't, and the actual message does get lost in harshness, right? The actual, because their nervous system has gone on high alert, they're not actually taking in whatever lesson the adult in question is wanting to give them.
exactly. Yeah, and it's fascinating because the research actually shows that when adults consistently take a punitive approach, children rarely change their behavior. In fact, their behavior may even get worse. The only thing that actually improves is their ability to hide the behavior of the adult. And that's what happens to that energy. And that's not what we're going for, right?
That actually gets in the way of, I talk about character development or morality, because the child then is thinking about, if there's a chance I get caught, I better not do this thing because then I'll get in trouble. Not, I better not do the thing because I don't want to hurt people or property, right? Their motivation for doing the quote right thing is totally mixed up depending on how they've been taught, right?
That's exactly right. And whether we're talking little kids, older kids, or even adults, we all naturally want to do well for the people we care about. I don't want to make my daughter mad any more than she wants to make me mad because a core common human value is that of connection. And when we feel connected, when we feel that we are in a healthy, high functioning relationship with somebody else, we naturally want to do the right things. And that can only happen where there's emotional safety.
Yeah. Going back to what you were talking about in terms of this sort of big why of peaceful parenting or gentle parenting, and your example of the, children who grow up with this learn to expect the world to be a kinder place and don't put up with being treated poorly. When my middle son was, I think he was in third grade, he had a teacher who was pretty strict and could be kind of harsh. And there was a child in the class who had some challenges. I'm not sure exactly what his diagnosis was, but he had some challenges, and he was always getting yelled at and sent to the principal's office. And my son would come home and he would just say, Mr. So and so is always talking about equity, and he's always talking about, like equitable treatment in the classroom. Doesn't he see that so and so has challenges and he's not treating this child equitably? It's like, you are so right. But he was like, even he must have been nine or so at the time, but he had this sense of, how you treat people, I think, based on how he was treated in the family.
I love that. I've got goosebumps from that example. And that's exactly what happens. You get children who won't stand for anything other than connection, kindness, goodness in the world. And they're the ones who advocate for the people who can't or don't advocate for themselves because they know what it feels like to be treated well. And seeing anything short of that is there's cognitive dissonance for them. It just doesn't make sense because they know it doesn't have to be that way. And there is another path forward. And the thing is, this is the path we can teach at home. And this doesn't mean we have to be perfect. I am definitely an imperfect parent. In fact, throughout my book, I probably share more examples of mistakes I made and what I learned from them than I did actual, oh, here's how to be, right all the time, because that's just not reality. But the repair process is so significantly different in peaceful parenting as well, where we do want to repair when we mess up with our children. We do want our children to see us acknowledging our mistakes because we're raising humans. They're going to make mistakes too. And when we model that compassion and kindness and that repair with them, they are then more likely to reflect that back when they make mistakes. And this is all part of a peaceful connection-based relationship.
Yeah, for sure. So what else do you say when it comes up in your community when parents say, well, I don't know what language you use, but we always talk about win-win solutions, that getting playful to get kids to put their pajamas on or come to the table or do whatever, that they get a little of what they want, which is play, and we get a little of what we want, which is moving through the schedule. And, that pushback that happens of like, well, they're not going to get people in their jobs who are going to get them, play with them to get them to do the report or whatever. What do you say to that doubt when it comes up?
I say two things to that. Number one is what we know about child development is that children are wired to play. This is something that develops very, very early in childhood. In fact, every single species does it. It is not unique to humans, but children begin life in play. It's how they learn, it's how they process information, it's how they process traumatic events. It is all through play. That is simply how their brains work. However, as they get older, children naturally play less because other parts of the brain develop, specifically parts that involve rational thinking. And the prefrontal cortex, which is in the very, very front of the brain, that doesn't actually fully develop until the child is between 25 and 30 years old. But that part of the brain, while it's growing, is learning about things like what are the consequences for my actions? How do other people feel when I act this way versus that way? If that part of the brain literally hasn't developed yet, we can't expect our children to use it. It's not there. So we have to work with them in a language that they can understand, which is play. And naturally, simply as a function of biological development, when those other parts of the brain grow and develop, they will become more serious, less reliant on the playful approaches to life, and they will think more like we do. So, of course, at age 22 or whenever they get their first job, they're not going to expect someone to play with them to get them to work because their brains aren't going to be wired the same way anymore. They're going to have a whole different set of neural connections that will drive their communication style. The other point that I'll make about this is I sincerely believe that all of us, regardless of age, benefit from more play. And I define play as anything that brings us joy. Some people might call it self-care. Some people might call it balance. Some people might call it, the work life, dyad, or whatever people call it. We know that we need to have fun in order to thrive. The body cannot thrive by just working alone. So when we do take playful approaches with our children, when we can be joyful alongside them, we actually benefit as well. Our stress hormones go down, our happy hormones go up. We thrive in our health, in our mental capacity, in our attention span. We as adults also gain from having a playful connection based approach with our children. It's not just for the kids.
Yeah, and I was just you said connection. I was gonna say we're also building that connection and putting what I call goodwill deposits into the bank account when we do find those win-win solutions and use play to go through the day with our children. I want to go back to one thing you said. I love what you when you talk connected it to the neuroscience of the brain development, and that a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old is not going to have the understanding for the intrinsic motivation to get ready for bed or get ready for school or whatever. But a 22-year-old is going to have that intrinsic motivation to do a job to do a job well done, whether it's because they like the paycheck or they like their work or they know they have to pay rent. But there's the motivation also changes as kids grow and turn into adults, and that the motivation develops. So I think that's important to also point out.
Absolutely. Yeah. I work not only because I like it, but also because I realize I get to eat when I work. So, children do grow into this understanding as well.
Yeah. And I think that, also I always talk about the habit that happens when cooperation becomes the habit rather than conflict, and that you are spending that time and energy to find those win-win solutions and to be playful, but it also changes the tone and temperature of your household, that cooperation and harmony becomes more habitual rather than the nagging and like, come on, I've told you 10 times. And it just, if for no other reason, it feels better.
It does, yeah. And something really interesting happens when we do this too. You are 100% correct in that we set the emotional tone and it becomes our default. This is what we can expect to feel most of the time. And we learn that just like our kids learn. When I'm with this person, it usually feels this way. And when you think about, pick any random person in your family of origin, or maybe a friend of yours or whatever, you probably have a gut reaction as to how you feel when you are in their presence. Well, we can nourish that through parenting this way to help it be a default positive for us and for our children too. And it contributes to something called confirmation bias, where when I believe things are going to be a certain way, I look for them consciously and subconsciously. And when I see that happening in real life, in this example, I expect I'm going to get along with my child. And when we get along, I can say, see, I knew I would get along with her. And my brain says, yep, you were right. Our brains love confirmation bias. We like to be right about things. And if that default tone and emotional mood in the house can be one of connection and getting along, this is another benefit to this approach. When there is a bump in the road, when there is a conflict, it doesn't ruin that overall tone and that overall expectation of how the relationship will go. Both parent and child are able to view it as the exception. Well, we had a hard morning, didn't we? But we're able to repair and recover from it so that we can have a more connected day going forward, as opposed to walking on eggshells around each other for the rest of our relationship.
Yeah, your Goodwill bank account can stand to have a few withdrawals, and you're not going to get close to like balance zero, right?
Exactly.
We continue with the analogy. What are some other things that you hear are coming up in your community, sort of doubts about the peaceful parenting approach and whether or not it really does, raise great kids? I mean, I have the benefit of having two adult children and one who's getting pretty close. So I can see the firsthand experience and how they are in the world and the things that I hear about them. I just as an aside, I was at the dentist yesterday, and my dentist is pregnant with her third child, and she she spent about 20 minutes picking my brain about different parenting things. And I said something, I was talking to her about manners, and I said I've never told my kids to say please or thank you, and they are so polite. And she said, good, she knows my kids. They're, my adult children go to her for she said, your kids are the best kids. Like, they're amazing. She's like, you never told them to say please or thank you? I'm like, no. She said, they're so polite. They're amazing. All three of them are so polite. And I was like, yeah, well, they learn by example. And that's just sort of, I guess, a little example of kids being out in the world. But I think parents do doubt when, your kid might be a little bit rude if they don't say please or thank you when they're little. And how can they possibly grow up into a polite, well-mannered young adult? So that's one doubt I think that comes up. What are some other ones that you find?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I will absolutely second the one that you just shared. That has been my experience and my approach as well. I also do not ever force my daughter to say please or thank you. She's watching me to figure out if I say it, and then she'll pick up my speech patterns, which she does. So it's a non issue for us. One of the other concerns that I hear about this approach is I don't have time for that. I don't have time to be playful. I don't have time to sit down and tell a story or read a story about the situation. I don't have time to invest all that. I just need to tell my child to do the thing and expect them to do the thing. That's what's got to happen. And my feedback to that is first of all, I hear it because I know how busy we are as parents. And I want to acknowledge that parenting can be emotionally exhausting. And we all have moments where we wish our child would just do the darn thing we're asking them to do. I get that. And that being said, when we parent this way, a couple of things happen. Number one is we are making an investment in the relationship so that it actually requires less time in the future. So, for example, if right after our discussion today, I go downstairs and start screaming at my child to put on her shoes because we're running late for whatever appointment, odds are good that she's not going to say, fantastic, I love it when you scream at me. I'm going to put on my shoes right away. Instead, she is probably going to start crying and not want to put on her shoes, and it'll become a power struggle. Well, I'll be lucky if we get out the door within an hour because now we've had this big emotional mess to clean up, as opposed to if I just went down and said, where are your mermaid fins? We need to swim to the car, and you know those things with the buckles that we put on? Where are those mermaid fins? Well, suddenly you've got a child who's transformed into a mermaid, and we're out the door in 30 seconds. So it's an investment of time.
Yeah,
And
you're generally going to spend the time one way or another. It's just what kind of energy is that time involving, right? Is it
exactly.
playful energy, which just does take more creativity and intentionality from us, or is it going to be nagging, yelling energy? Either way, you are expending energy and time.
Exactly. Yeah. And the other part of it that I actually talk a lot about in the story teaching part of my book, although I've got a big section on playful parenting, big section on story teaching, the story teaching is how we can use stories as peaceful, benevolent teachers as well. And a lot of people are like, I don't have time to tell a story. Let me tell you why stories are so important. We've got a part of our brain called the hippocampus, which is the storyteller of the brain. It is what records our memories. So if you happen to be one of the many, vast majority of people in society who has a visual that accompanies your memory, it's your hippocampus that does that. And when we tell a story, it helps create a visual for the child. So they have an anchor. They have an anchor in their brain. And let's say, I'm going to use an example here, keying off what I started a moment ago, and I'm just making this up on the fly. So, total disclaimer, can't vouch for the quality of the story that's about to come out of my mouth here. But let's say that getting out the door has typically been a sticking point for my child and me, and I want to find a way to make it more peaceful. Well, maybe I decide I'm going to turn this into a story. So, this is something we can work with ahead of time instead of when it's a power struggle in the moment. So I might sit down with my child after breakfast today and say, do you know that once upon a time there was a mermaid who did not like to swim? And one day she realized it was because she had the wrong color fins. So all of the fish of the ocean got together with their paints and their paintbrushes, and they came and they painted her fins whatever insert your child's shoe color is here. They painted her fins that color, and next thing you know, she loved slithering, swimming through the ocean to the, mermaid castle door where she was able to leave peacefully. So then, fast forward a couple of hours, I can say to my child, instead of, it's time to go put on your shoes, and then I duck for cover because I'm afraid of the power struggle that's about to come, I can whisper to my child, do you remember the mermaid story? Let's go find your fins. And then you go on a search together and you make it fun, you make it playful. But you go find those shoes that are magically the same color as the mermaid fins. You get them on the feet, and you have a child who is in their play brain, as children are designed to be. And you miss the battle entirely because, once again, you invested in a way that's going to go straight to that hippocampus, straight to that part of the brain that is an anchor. And it too is involved in the emotional safety of the situation. And next time, let's say tomorrow when it's time to go again, I might only have to say, let's find our fins again. And you have a child who has a memory of the story because the story is much more memorable than go put on your shoes, right? And then the child is like, oh, I can picture this. I know exactly what I'm supposed to do. And they've got that anchor to draw from.
So I think you get a really good mark for that story that you just made up on the fly. I thought that was good. You get an A. And, you and I are in agreement on this. And I can just hear some doubters saying, yeah, but what if their teacher tells them to do something? Or what if their, coach tells them to do something and the coach or the teacher isn't like, forget the 22-year-old with a job. Think about the, 10-year-old at gym class or whatever. My experience is that, my kids, I could be like that with them at home. And they were very well behaved and always got the great compliments from teachers and coaches. And I never experienced that, but that's just my experience. So from a more, I guess, scientific or point of view, how do you explain to a parent who says, well, sometimes kids just have to do what they're told, and why should we have to jump through hoops to like mermaid stories to get them to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. The good news here is that you don't always need a mermaid story. We often don't give kids the credit that they deserve, in that you're absolutely right. There is going to be the teacher or the coach or whoever who says, it's time to get your shoes. But here you have a child who has emotional safety with the concept of putting on shoes. The word shoes is not going to be a trigger for them. So, because we created that safety for them at home first, it's a transferable skill. So that if somebody else says, hey, it's time to go do that thing, they're going to say, I feel safe with that thing. That thing is not a point of major conflict in my life. So, sure, I'll go grab my shoes. And you, too, as a parent, don't always have to remember to call them mermaid fins. You can say, grab your shoes, starting next week or whenever it feels right to you and your family. And the child will have learned the lesson and been able to transfer it to other relationships and other dynamics in their life.
Well, I think we have to come back to the idea that kids do want to do the right thing. And, one thing that I don't know if you're familiar with the book, The Self-Driven Child, that Ned Johnson and William Six read. They talk about research in that book that addresses this exact doubt that parents have about, well, if, we're always giving choices or telling stories or whatever at home, what about the real world? And they actually cite research that shows that it's actually easier for kids to accept authority out in the quote real world from teachers and coaches, et cetera, when they have more autonomy at home. And I think that, I don't know, maybe we all have just a finite amount of being bossed around that we can that we can handle. And the less we're bossed around at home, the easier it is to get bossed around out in the world and not have a problem with it. Just do what the authority figure is telling us to do.
Exactly. Yep. And, all the points for that book too. I love Ned and Bill and they're fantastic. So everybody, I'd love it if you buy my book, but also buy their books. It's fantastic.
It is a great book, and I find myself referring to it often. I think it comes back to the idea of internalizing the right thing to do when you're choosing to do it. Your child with the mermaid fins is choosing to go and get their shoes on, and that they're internalizing that intrinsic motivation to do the right thing. And that's also what gets drawn on at school or in sports or whatever, that they want to do the right thing and that feels good to them and that they're choosing it.
Exactly. Yeah. And every single time, all arrows, all signs are pointing to connection and relationship. And we're laying the groundwork for that with this approach. That's all it boils down to.
What about the doubt that parents have sometimes that you can't really learn without consequences? That kids, if we don't give them, and by consequences, I mean punishment, taking things away or timeouts or whatever it is, and that kids need that to learn. And if we're not using them, that they won't learn.
I love that question. Thank you for asking. This is one that I love turning around with compassion and yet with, kind of a pointed question to the person who asks it. You, as an adult, whoever the you may be, do you learn best through punishments or do you learn best through connection? So, for example, if you don't finish your report on time for work, do you learn best by your boss sitting down with you or your coworker sitting down with you and saying, "Hey, I'm curious if your workload is too heavy. Maybe we need to shift some things around, or do you have any questions? Maybe I can offer you some support. Maybe we can reallocate resources. What's going on for you? Or, maybe you have something going on at home. Do you need like a day off so you can focus and then come back fresh? Do you learn better that way? Or do you learn better by the boss who comes and stands over you and says, well, now you can't come to the company picnic?"
I was gonna. I use that exact example, except I say, yells at you in front of all your fellow employees, says you have to stay late, and takes part of your paycheck away.
Right, right, exactly. Yeah, any one of these. And of course, people are like, well, that's ridiculous. Of course, I just want the boss to figure out what the root cause is of my not getting the report done. And the same applies to children. They are, in this way, wired no differently from us. They just want to be understood. And if there is some sort of a problem, our job, I love this quote. It's not my quote. I learned it from a woman named Kelly Matthews, who learned it from her mentor, who was Deb Curtis. And I don't know where Deb Curtis got it. These are not famous people, by the way, but they're good people. And it's don't get mad, get curious. And it's been one of my mainstays in parenting because of course sometimes I get mad. I'm a real person. But when I can pause just long enough to say, hold on, there's more to the story here. I wonder what else is going on. There is always a good reason when my child is not behaving optimally. And when I strive to figure out what that is, I have never, ever, ever had to punish her because it's always been something that we can simply work on together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that. That's beautiful. And I love the idea of getting curious. I was in a conference that Yolanda Williams put together from Parenting Decolonized, and our topic was peaceful family culture and what does that mean? And the two of us kind of spitballed it, some emails back and forth with each other, and that was one of the things that we came up with was leading with curiosity whenever there's a situation in the family or with our child, is to lead with curiosity. And I had a mom once in my Facebook group who said that she had remembered to do that, and her 3-year-old wasn't getting in the car when he was supposed to be getting in the car, and instead of yelling at him, what are you doing? You're supposed to be getting in the car right now. She kind of just stopped and went, what are you doing right now? And he said, oh, I was afraid we were going to forget the blah, blah, blah. So I'm just getting it for us. And, he had actually a real thing that he was doing that was helpful. And she, because she was curious, she avoided what could have been a really negative interaction between the two of them.
Absolutely, yeah. I hear that and I can relate to it. I remember one time, my daughter was not coming downstairs and we were running late for something and I was getting more and more agitated because I was calling upstairs, it's time to go, we're running late, whatever. I was not being my most playful connection-based self. And finally, I went upstairs and did the same thing, kind of paused and said, I'm curious, even though I was kind of like feeling shaky on the inside. I'm like, I'm curious, why aren't you coming downstairs yet? She's like, oh, I didn't realize we were late. I was putting away the laundry. And I was like, you were what? Like, oh my goodness. Okay. Like, never in my wildest dreams would I think that a then 7-year-old would stay upstairs to put away laundry. Like that wasn't quote unquote chores. This was just something she decided to do. So had I started yelling at her from downstairs, what kind of message would that have been? Just don't ever put away the laundry again? Like,
Yeah. Try and be helpful and you get burned.
exactly.
Well,
Exactly.
that reminds me when you were talking about the time investment and the payoff later. You were talking day to day in your example, but also I have the benefit perspective of years now, right? Of the time investment. And one thing, you talk about chores. One thing we talk about is a culture of family being on the family team and helping each other. And, you can force your 5-year-old to take the plate to the dishwasher and put it in the dishwasher. However, that's not really in support of that culture of we're doing it because we want to be part of the family team and we're helping each other out. And that's sort of what we raised our kids with that. And my husband and I went for a hike on Sunday without the kids, and I actually only have one at home now. But when we came home, she'd cleaned the kitchen. She's 15, and she said, "Mom, I cleaned the kitchen." And I was like, "Thank you so much. Really appreciate that." But these time investments that you put in when they're little, they do really pay off when your kids are older. And I think you'll see that more and more as your daughter gets older too, even though she's already doing chores at 7. So
Yeah, and the thing is, it's like, I'm with you. This is not something we force. This is just the culture that we are raising her in, where we just help each other. And, I don't like to be forced into helping. That doesn't cultivate a spirit of generosity in me.
and it doesn't feel good, and then that pro-social behavior doesn't develop if it doesn't feel good, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And you said another word a couple of minutes ago that I want to touch on just briefly, the word consequences, because, sometimes people think, and this is, I think, the final misconception that we can address today, but, positive parenting, peaceful discipline has no consequences. That's actually false. We've got natural consequences and logical consequences, and both can very much be a part of the peaceful discipline approach. And I talk about both of those fairly extensively in the book, because consequences happen to all of us, but we forget some consequences are positive. If I say to you, Sarah, I am so glad to be here talking with you today. You are just a joy. I'm guessing the consequence is those words of affirmation probably feel good to you. That's a consequence, right? So we forget the consequences can be positive. And yet, using a parenting example, if a child refuses to put on their shoes. I don't know why I'm stuck on shoes today. It's just theme of the day. If a child refuses to put on their shoes and they are late to their swim class, and then they're disappointed because they didn't get to swim for as long as they wanted to swim, the disappointment of not being able to swim as long as they wanted to swim, that is a consequence that is a teacher for them. We don't need to do anything above and beyond to make them feel worse for it. They already feel badly because now they're learning, oh, we didn't get there on time, therefore I didn't get to swim as long as I wanted to. And these things are wonderful and highly effective teachers where we can simply support our children alongside them rather than making them feel worse about anything.
100%. And I'll point out just the definition of natural consequences is something that happens without any interference from us. Because sometimes I hear people say, well, what should the natural consequence for this be? And I'm like, well, if you have to ask yourself that question, it's not a natural consequence. But we also have to be careful with your example. If we pile on, I call it piling on with, well, if you'd gotten ready faster, you would have had more time to swim. We think we have to make it a teachable moment and point it out. And if we do that piling on, then that actually can prevent the learning from the natural consequence, because then our child's just angry or hurt from us and they're not actually feeling like, oh yeah, I was dilly dallying and so I didn't get to swim for as long. And so actually coming alongside with empathy is so much more effective. Like, oh, I'm so sorry you didn't get to swim for as long as you wanted to today. Oh, I bet you wish you got ready faster, huh? Like, with a lot of warmth and compassion, and not like the I told you so. But I just wanted to add on to what you were saying because I love that.
I'm so glad you did. That is a really, really important point, and I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been really great. And I know that there are a lot of my listeners who are new to peaceful parenting, and I know they probably have those little doubts and those questions that come up about the approach. So I'm really grateful that we were able to have this conversation about some of those big, I guess, the doubts that people might have sometimes about this approach, and the science that you provide and the experience we both have had in knowing that we don't need to worry about those things. I appreciate that. So before I let you go, I want to ask you the question that I ask all of my guests, which is, if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
My advice would generally be to trust my gut a whole lot more. There is so much misinformation on the internet from other parents, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of it is not based on connection. It's not based on brain science. It's not based on child development. And it's simply based on outdated stuff that isn't serving our relationships anymore. So I would want my younger self to be met with compassion and permission to simply trust her intuition. And if my intuition says, comfort the child, be with the child, connect with the child, do that every single time because it's the foundation for everything else.
That's beautiful. Where can our listeners find out more about you and what you do?
Sure. So I am Dandelion Seeds Positive Parenting on all of the socials except for Instagram, which is Dandelion Seeds Positive Living, because parenting didn't fit. I am at dandelionseeds.com with a hyphen between dandelion and seeds. And then, of course, my book will be available on my website, Amazon, and all of the major places where books are sold.
And we'll link to it in the show notes as well. So thank you so much, Sarah. And I appreciate you and appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. I hope you found this conversation insightful and exactly what you needed in this moment. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Remember that I'm rooting for you. I see you out there showing up for your kids and doing the best you can. Sending hugs over the airwaves today. Hang in there. You've got this.